Good morning, conference. It is an honour to stand on this stage as our party's spokesperson for justice. And while I would typically kick off a speech up here by telling you all about somewhere where the sun shines, I need to be honest with you and start by telling you about a place where long shadows are cast. And that is in our criminal justice system. After years of conservative neglect, our prisons have reached breaking point. Last summer, in fact, we were 80-odd places away from our men's prison estate becoming completely full, and we're only months away from getting to that stage again. Court backlogs are rife, and victims are waiting years and years to have their days in court. Conference, justice delayed is justice denied. Added to that, reoffending rates are through the roof. 80% of people reoffend within 9 years of their conviction, according to Ministry of Justice figures. And I saw some of this total dysfunction up close before I was elected as Eastbourne's Liberal Democrat MP. It started a decade ago when I moved from Eastbourne to the East End, very different, where I volunteered full-time as a youth intervention coach, supporting young ex-offenders and at-risk young people away from crime and into employment. And I remember working with young people who felt backed into crime's corner. One in particular saying, I don't want to steal bikes or deal drugs, but I do it so I can secretly slip cash into my mum's handbag week after week to help her pay the bills. These kind of memories and insights and experiences stay with you. I remember asking a young person to come in for a work opportunity in smart trousers, and he looked at me completely blankly and replied, "Do you mean court trousers?" And while that can tickle us in some ways, it is a fundamental sadness that there are young people in our country who are more accustomed to the criminal justice system than they are to the world of work or than they are to our education system. And I remember reading even more about this at the time, the phenomenon of the so-called school-to-prison pipeline, the research-backed near inevitability that school exclusion was a slippery slope to criminality in so many cases. Conference, that kind of path dependency is an affront to liberalism. No one's circumstances should consign them to a future of criminality. So I couldn't just let that all slide, and I sought to do my bit to address some of these issues by setting up an organisation that trained and employed ex-offenders and at-risk young people. Specifically, we trained and employed them to repair smashed iPhone screens. 29% of people have a smashed smartphone screen, and the average person swipes, scrolls or taps on their device 2,617 times a day. We got a lot of business, and I'll give 29% of you my card before the speech is out. But what we did is we trained and employed them to do that work running pop-up repair shops in large workplaces, including the headquarters of Barclays. We did it in the Ministry of Justice, and we did it in the US Embassy. And this was back in 2018 in particular, under Trump's first presidency. We took offenders with convictions for things like wielding an axe into Trump's embassy to repair his diplomats' phones, all in the name of rehabilitation. I'm not sure that Trump Mark II would permit such a thing. But through that work, we supported young people like Tariq. And Tariq was referred to us by his youth offending team and had been in the young offenders institution. And with mentoring and support and employment from myself and my team, he turned his life around, having been empowered to do so with the tools that we provided, physical tools and metaphorical ones. and we caught up the other day. I'm pleased to say he's kept out of trouble. And more than that, Tariq is now a door-to-door salesman, Conference. A professional door knocker. No joke. He is doing Liberal Democrats proud. But let me tell you what else does our party proud, Conference. Our unwavering belief in the power of rehabilitation, embodied in stories like Tariq's. I'm proud of our ambitious plan to break the cycle of crime by putting rehabilitation at the heart of every aspect of our criminal justice system, a plan that you passed at Autumn Conference last year. I'm proud that we're bold enough to say that we can't build our way out of the prisons crisis. I'm proud that Liberal Democrats are bold enough to say that we can rehabilitate our way out of this crisis. Now, Labour, though, they're just not being ambitious enough about this. And we are only in this situation in the first place because the Conservatives failed to prioritise rehabilitation. In fact, the only rehabilitation they seem to be interested in these days is the rehabilitation of their own image, which strangely they think they can do by trying to steal Reform's clothes. For example, this week they've been mimicking Farage's cries that we have a two-tier justice system in our country. Well, let's give them some credit. They are right in a way. Two-tier justice has existed in our country because we've been governed by two-tier Tories who thought they could get away with illegal number 10 parties while telling the rest of us to stay home. Two-tier Tories like Shadow Justice Secretary Robert Jenrick, who unlawfully approved a development for a major donor, yet tries to lecture us on law and order. Two-tier Tories who have pummeled our prisons and crashed our courts, leaving victims to pay the price. Conference, we will not be taking any lectures from the Conservatives on justice. Instead, we are showing them what fighting for justice actually looks like. Just look at John Milne, for example, our MP for Horsham, who, alongside Ed, has been fighting the bureaucratic court system to unlock child trust funds owed to disabled children and their families. That is what justice looks like. Look at Helen Morgan, who just this week in the House of Commons advanced the effort to ensure that the family courts can't be used to perpetrate abuse. That is what justice looks like. Look at Caroline Voden MP, who is fighting for victim support organisations to be protected amid Labour's funding cuts and Nick's hike that is hitting charities with real terms budget cuts. That is what justice looks like. Liberal Democrats are fighting for those on the receiving end of crime and injustice, so let down by the Conservatives. Conference, we are the party fighting for victims. Now, an area where we need to see urgent action to protect victims is when it comes to survivors of domestic abuse. And I will say now that I'm going to share a number of experiences, so of my own and some of other people, by means of a trigger warning. Now, having grown up seeing what domestic abuse looks like firsthand, this mission is pretty personal to me. And I know that it's personal to so many in our party and across the country. 1 in 5 people will experience domestic abuse in their lifetimes, and that needs to change. But too often, the law leaves survivors without the protection they deserve. And the government's emergency early release scheme made that painfully clear last year. And recognising the problems that a scheme like that would cause for survivors, the government made a commitment to try to exclude domestic abusers from that scheme. But it hasn't been the case in practice. This is because an exclusion of that sort, of domestic abusers from an early release scheme, can only be made on the basis of the offence committed. But there is no specific offence of domestic abuse in the law. So it is impossible at the moment to commit to such a task. Instead, many domestic abusers are convicted of general offences like actual bodily harm, assault, or battery that do not reflect the full gravity of the abuse. It's the same offence that somebody could be convicted of for a brawl in a pub with a stranger they've never come across before. And what's more is that in England and Wales, these are offences that are criminalised by the Offences Against the Person Act 1861, written without domestic abuse in mind. This is bonkers, conference. Now, I've met a brave survivor who was affected by this unacceptable state of affairs. Her abuser assaulted her and held a knife to her throat. That abuser was convicted of actual bodily harm. But despite this, that brave survivor was originally told that her abuser was eligible for the government's emergency release scheme, despite commitments to the opposite. That cannot be right, conference. Now, one could debate whether or not an early release scheme is morally right or wrong. But what is not for debate is that when, as a government, you make a commitment to survivors like the one this government made, you must keep those promises. And the government can only keep commitments to survivors like this in future if it properly recognises domestic violence and domestic abuse in the law. So what are Liberal Democrats doing about this, conference? Well, on our party's behalf, I've tabled a bill to create a specific set of domestic abuse aggravated offences in the law for the first time. These would work similarly to racially and religiously aggravated offences in England and Wales. So instead of just being convicted of ABH, say, a domestic abuser would be convicted of domestic abuse aggravated ABH. Abusers would no longer be able to hide behind general offences. And this change would not only make it possible for the government to exempt domestic abusers from a future early release scheme, if that is a commitment that a government is to make, but it would also improve our data to keep people safe. I'll give you an example. I recently wrote to the Ministry of Justice with what I thought was a pretty simple question. How many domestic abusers are currently in prison, and what is their reoffending rate? The answer, conference, and I quote, was this: "It is not possible to robustly calculate the number of domestic abusers in prison or their reoffending rate. This is because these crimes are recorded under the specific offences for which they are prosecuted, i.e., we do not know how many domestic abusers there are in prison because there is no specific offence of domestic abuse in the law." This is a national scandal. The government has a powerful ambition, and Liberal Democrats stand by this, to halve violence against women and girls over the next decade. But how on earth can we possibly know if we're achieving that if we do not know how many domestic abusers are in prison? And more than that, how can we be serious about reducing reoffending? How can we know what kind of interventions work best to stem this kind of crime if we are not properly measuring it because there is no specific offence of domestic abuse in the law? We can only change this through legislation, and I'm determined to drive that change on behalf of our party. I'm so proud to say that our bill, in light of everything it seeks to achieve, in light of the listening that we've done working with survivors across the country, our bill has the backing of organisations like Refuge, Women's Aid, Victim Support, and Mankind. Our petition pushing this bill has already been signed by over 50,000 survivors and their supporters across the country. We have lobbied every single minister going on this, who has a relevant portfolio, and had some very constructive meetings to help get this over the line. We've rallied together MPs from across the House to back this, including, crucially, some Labour MPs who are privately offering their support and who look increasingly willing to speak out. As a result of all this campaigning conference, all this pressure, I'm pleased to share that earlier this week we secured a key breakthrough on our campaign. The Victims Minister finally confirmed to me that there is a problem here and that, I quote, "The government and I are actively considering how we can better identify domestic abuse offenders, and I want to reassure him that nothing is off the table. I'd be happy to work with him, and I invite him to come and meet me in the Ministry of Justice to discuss how best we do that in more detail." Conference, that is progress. That is what the influence of 72 Liberal Democrat MPs and our activists can achieve. This represents hope for millions of survivors of domestic abuse across our country who have been waiting for justice. But we will not stop until the government's promising words become serious action. That's why we will be tabling an amendment to the Crime and Policing Bill currently going through Parliament that would see a new set of specific domestic abuse aggravated offences created. We'll do this to keep up the pressure. Conference, that is what a party for victims does. That is what a party for justice does, and that is what the Liberal Democrats do. Watch this space, Conference. Thank you.